Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second movie on the Exodus, and thanks for tuning in. So, what happened in this story? Well, it turns out that the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, were slaves, according to the story, in the land of Egypt. And the problem was they were becoming very, very numerous, right? And this poses a big political problem for Egypt. And the reason it poses a problem is because the Egyptians are afraid that the Israelite slaves will sort of rise up in rebellion against them, perhaps join a rival army and overthrow the Egyptian government, right? Now, by the way, in the South, before the Civil War, lots of slave owners and plantation owners also had the same fear about African American slaves here in the States. So it's a reasonable fear. If I were a slave, I'd want to rise up and overthrow my master as well. Okay, so what do the Egyptians do in response? Well, the text tells us that they get increasingly ruthless, and eventually they command the midwives. A midwife, by the way, is just somebody that sort of helps deliver babies. And they command the midwives to kill all the Jewish baby boys. But, unfortunately, for the Egyptians, the midwives are not able to do it. Maybe they just didn't want to, because it's a pretty cruel thing to just deliver a baby and then kill them. So what they say is,
well, the problem is that the Hebrew mothers are just so athletic. They just stop and have a kid, and off they go before we can even get there. So we weren't able to kill all the Jewish boys.
But into this story, you have the story of Moses. Now, Moses' mother knows about the Egyptian decree, and so what she does is she puts the baby Moses into a little bassinet, floats it down the Nile River, and lo and behold, Pharaoh's daughter finds the bassinet in the river and thinks that it's been sent to her especially from a god or something. Okay. Now, you should also know that this is almost certainly folklore, right? There are a number of other stories around the ancient Near East of significant people who were saved as a baby in just this way. Now, her sister watches over the little bassinet. And sure enough, when the Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses, the sister runs up and says,
"Oh, I see you found a little baby. You're probably going to need a wet nurse."
Right, that is a woman who's able to nurse the baby, to breastfeed the baby. And she says,
"I have just the person for you."
And of course, that person is Moses' actual mother, okay? Now, the text tells us about one sentence related to Moses' upbringing. And all it says is, he grew up in the house of Pharaoh. Now, if you've ever watched The Prince of Egypt, you know that the movie goes on and on and on about Moses' relationship to Ramses, but the text doesn't tell us anything about that at all. It just says he grew up in the house of the Pharaoh. Okay, so after he grows up, the next thing we know is he sees an Egyptian arguing with a Hebrew, and he
kills him.
He hides his body, buries his body in the sand. Then the next day, turns out he overhears some people talking about him, and he's afraid that he's going to get discovered. So he flees the land of Egypt. He takes off and leaves and goes to Midian. And while he's there, he marries a Midianite woman. Now, this is sort of interesting because Moses traditionally is the one that's given the law by God. According to later Israelite law, Israelite men were not allowed to marry Midianite women, but Moses does, right? After this, he's tending some sheep or something, and he sees something up in the mountain, and now it's Mount Horeb. Horeb is the Hebrew word for wilderness. So he's in the wilderness. Wilderness is a scary place all across the ancient world, and gods are oftentimes living there. So he sees this burning bush, which is described as,
"There's a fire in the bush, but the bush is not consumed."
And of course, God calls him to go and set the Israelites free. Then at one point, Moses says to them, but says to God, "Whom should I tell them sent me? What's your name?" And so God says to him,
"I am who I am."
Tell them that I am sent you. Now that seems like a really weird kind of name, quite frankly. Now this is a sort of a special case, a hiphil form of the word Yahweh, okay? It's a creative or a causative form, so it's almost like God is the one who causes to be, the creator God, right? The source of everything. What you have after this is that Moses is told by God to go to Pharaoh, tell him to let the people go, but then God says to him,
But he's going to say no, because I'm going to harden his heart, so he says no.
and once he says no, then we're going to send a plague. And there's about 10 plagues. This happens over and over, and you should read it in the text. Finally, Pharaoh lets the people go. They leave in a big march out of Egypt. They come to the Red Sea. At the Red Sea, the Egyptian army had pursued them. Pharaoh kind of changed his mind. He was kind of bummed that all the slaves are gone. He might have some people, friends of his, that might have to start working. Come to the Red Sea. The Egyptian army follows them. All the people are really bummed out. They say to Moses, did you just bring us up here to run into the Red Sea and then get slaughtered by Pharaoh's army? Moses parts the Red Sea. The people walk across. When Pharaoh's army tries to come through, the waters flow back on the Egyptian army, and they are done. So that's basically the story until you get to the wanderings in the wilderness. That's just basically what happens in the story of the Exodus. And next time we'll talk about God's motivation. Thanks a lot for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
I guess you